Good morning and welcome to this webinar. Today's session is Levelling Up, Shared Challenges for England's Towns and Cities. My name's Chris Smith and I launched the Centre for the New Midlands back in May 2020, very much with this ethos around levelling up, taking back control at the heart of the country's politics. The Centre for the New Midlands, we are the only non-partisan independent think tank for the West Midlands region. And for those of you who may not be too familiar with the region, it's predominantly the areas of Birmingham, Coventry, Wolverhampton, Solihull, Sandwell, Dudley and Walsall. We are absolutely delighted to be co-hosting today's session with the Centre for London and CLES, which is the Centre for Local Economic Strategies. For me, levelling up is such a concept that will remain ultimately at the heart of the country's politics, regardless of who the governing party happens to be. This notion of spreading opportunity and opportunities and wealth throughout the country and rebalancing the country's economy has to be at the heart of what's driving the political parties across the country. For me, although clearly I have a real interest and a focus on the West Midlands, the reality is levelling up cannot come at the cost of levelling down London. It has to be so much so that the rest of the country benefits, as well as spreading the wealth across the country. So without further ado, I'm delighted to pass you over to Claire Harding, who's the Research Director for the Centre for London, who will be able to guide you through the rest of today's session. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Chris, and thank you everybody for joining us. It's great to be doing this joint session today. As Chris said, my name's Claire. I'm the Research Director at Centre for London, and over the last year, I've had the mostly pleasure and occasionally dubious pleasure of running our work on levelling up. And one of the things that's really important to us as an organisation is, as Chris said, this idea of not setting parts of the country against each other and instead talking about how we can solve problems together. So that's what we're going to be talking about today, I hope, and also about the opportunities and challenges that the levelling up agenda has presented to the places that they represent and how they're working with local government and how it can work better. Before we begin properly, I'd like to thank our generous Levelling Up sponsors at Centre for London for supporting this programme of work. Now, this is always a slightly silly moment because there's quite a lot of them, so I shall rattle through. Thank you very much to the City Bridge Trust, Trust for London, the Greater London Authority, the University of London, London Councils, the City of London Corporation, Central London Forward, the G15, the London boroughs of Enfield, Brent and Hounslow, and last but certainly not least, the South London Partnership. We really couldn't do it without you, so we're very grateful. I'll now quickly run through our agenda and share some tips on how you can best engage with us on Zoom before we get to the main event, which is our absolutely brilliant panel. So I'll introduce them in just a second. They'll then talk for about half an hour, 40 minutes, and then there'll be an opportunity for them to answer some of your questions before the event comes to a close at 11. We are streaming publicly on YouTube today, so if you have friends or colleagues who'd like to see this but weren't able to join us, you'll be able to watch it back afterwards and share the link. And if you have technical problems with Zoom, we know they can happen. Please jump onto that YouTube stream. Just search Centre for London in YouTube. If you would like to ask a question, we love questions, please do. Please don't use the raise a hand function. It just makes it a little bit hard for us to chair and manage all of that. So you've got a couple of things you can do. If you want to share reactions and comments, talk to other people in this webinar, please use the chat function in Zoom. I'm sure you've all done that many times before. Please do remember to include your name and organisation when you're sending a message so that everybody knows who you are. And I'm sure I don't need to tell you all this because you're all absolutely lovely people, but please do be nice. We want this to be a space where people can have open, positive discussions, and it's distracting for other people if that stops. If you would like your question to be seen by the panel so they can answer it, there is a separate Q&A function in Zoom, so please use that. Please do get your questions in nice and early. We like to see them. You can put them in at any point in the webinar, and you can also use the thumbs up button to vote for questions that you'd like to see asked. I'll then be sharing the most popular ones for the panel. So if there's a question you like, please upvote it. That way it's much more likely to be answered. And you can also participate in the conversation on Twitter using the hashtag #LevelUpCities. Gosh, that was a lot, wasn't it? Thank you for bearing with all of that. Now for the important part of the session, I'm delighted to introduce our absolutely brilliant expert panelists this morning. We're so lucky to have such an interesting group from all across England. So first of all, I'll introduce them in the order in which they'll be speaking. So firstly, Sarah Longland, the Chief Executive at the Centre for Local Economic Studies, or CLES. Thank you so much for working with us on this event and for joining us today. Also Councillor John Merry, the Deputy City Mayor for Salford and the Chair of Key Cities. And last but certainly not least, Councillor Anthony Okereke, Leader of the Council for the Royal Borough of Greenwich, my wonderful neighbouring borough. It's great to have you all with us today. So going through to Sarah first. Sarah, I know CLES has done lots of really interesting work on this area, so great to hear your reflections, and then maybe we'll have a quick chance for a few quick follow-up questions after that. Thank you.
Brilliant, thank you, Claire, and thanks for the invitation to come along this morning and speak at this event, and to meet all of you online as well. As Claire said, I'm from CLES, the Centre for Local Economic Strategies, and I'll just tell you a little bit about CLES for those of you who don't know us. We are the national organisation for local economies, and since our inception back in 1986, our mission has been very much about the development of local economies which work for people, planet and place. And we do research, we develop ideas, and we convene conversations about how do we bring about local economic change and good public services. We're also the lead organisation for community wealth building in the UK, and I'll talk a little bit more about that, but that's really about how do we increase the flow of wealth that we already have into local communities, and how do we really harness the combined heft of anchor institutions in places across the UK. We are based in Manchester, but we work across the UK. We do a lot of work in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. We work in London, and we've just started doing some work in the Republic of Ireland as well. And so our work is very much on a day-to-day basis, dealing with the kind of the subject matter of today's discussion, the many and varied challenges of communities right across the UK. And I think important not just between regions or places, but within places. So even somewhere like London, all of you will know there are huge differences between the quality of life compared with in one place compared with another. And I think that's the case right across the piece. And sometimes the levelling up debate is framed as a sort of north versus south or east versus west. And I think in reality, the challenges of place are much more complex than that, and we shouldn't, as Chris was saying, we shouldn't be trying to pit each other against ourselves. So this is a shared challenge for all of us, and if there is inequality in any one of our places in the UK, well, that's not just bad for that place, but it's bad for all of us, and really trying to harness that sense of a shared challenge and a shared mission to deal with that in as fair a way as we can. So I just wanted to touch on two things really over the next sort of few minutes. One is just about those challenges, and then the second is about the opportunities that we can see through a kind of community wealth building lens. So the first thing is about the fact that whilst we share these challenges, there is something important about the way in which place has a direct impact on the ability of people to live a good life. There's a kind of really curious interplay between people and place. And, there's no doubt that even at the minute, we know that people across the UK face really serious challenges as a result of cost of living, recovery from the pandemic, and obviously, all of the other massive challenges that we're dealing with at the minute. And the statistics can tell us that. We know that, across the country, 8.5 million people are struggling with debt, and 14 million people across the UK have, got less than £100 in saving. And we know it's particularly difficult for people who rent their home, and we know there's a very large percentage of those in London, and many at the minute, many people can't afford to move and are staying in their own homes as renters, and then also having to pay quite a large proportion of their income in energy. And I think that all these issues are really shared at the moment, but it's clear that when it comes to levelling up, people do matter, but so does geography. And where you live in the UK whether and where in that region you live matters, and can it's not just that you know, it's not just about the geography, it's about the way in which geography can exacerbate the people-based inequalities that already exist. And, you know, for example, if you're a child growing up in a low-income family where your parents are on minimum wage, have, you know, insecure levels of work, or are very dependent on private rented accommodation, then you're probably much more likely to fall into poverty. But these factors will be further exacerbated by place-based factors that can make things even worse for a child at risk in poverty. And that will you know, perhaps the starkest example of that is, you know, what's been called the Glasgow effect, where research has shown that even in comparison with cities with similar levels of deprivation, there are unique place-based factors which create an additional barrier to people being able to live a good life. Now, that's the extreme example, but that place-based effect we can see regardless of where we are in the UK. We can see it in London, we can see it in Manchester, we can see it in rural Cumbria. There are particular place-based factors which stop people from being able to live a good life. And you can see that within, for example, the north of England too, where whatever metric you look at, there are certain places in the north of England where people tend to get sicker earlier and they die younger. And that also then has knock-on effects for our democratic system. Because if you aren't able to live a good life, if you aren't able to pay your bills, if you're not earning enough to be able to heat your home, that also reduces your sense of your own agency, your own control over your life, never mind your sense of agency over political representation. So I think that people matter in this debate around levelling up, but so does place. And I think that's why there does have to be a really important focus on geography. But I think that the issue is often that's presented as, okay, so therefore the money has to go into places that are most deprived, which are, you know, for example, in the north of England. But what that misses is that the outcome of levelling up isn't automatic. That if you're seeing growth starting to rise, if you're starting to see income flowing into your community, the need to level up doesn't stop there, because growth is an answer, but it isn't magic. And you have to intervene directly to ensure that the growth that you have got or that is coming into your area can actually make a difference to people's lives. And we think that that's crucially important. And that's why levelling up is so important for places across the UK, Manchester, London, the north of England, where we are seeing growth coming in and investment coming into those areas. That's why levelling up is important in those communities as well, because you've got to make sure that where we have got growth, we've also got the capacity to spread that growth and to make sure that wealth is flowing into people's pockets through jobs, through decent housing, and through decent public services on the ground. And of course, that's particularly in the context of 12 years of austerity, where we know public services are under huge pressure. And that isn't just bad in terms of public service delivery, it's actually bad for growth. Because if you don't have those basic levels of public services, regardless of where you are in the country, then that will undermine your ability to really grow your economy. And health particularly is a prime example of that. So the final thing I want to mention then is one of the ways that we try to look at this at CLES is through the lens of community wealth building, because we think that regardless of where you are, regardless of your economic, the state of your economy, or the challenges that you face, community wealth building is a way to try and understand how you can actually make a difference, how you can increase the flow of wealth through 5 key levers. And those are finance, spending through procurement, land and assets, employment and recruitment process, and ownership. And thinking through how you as an anchor organisation or you as a public service provider can really harness the power of those 5 levers to deliver positive economic outcomes for your area. Because what we see is anchor organisations, public organisations who have a direct relationship with that place. They are an active participant in the economy, and they have a huge direct role to play in actually supporting levelling up and supporting better outcomes for people and place. And I think that ability to be able to intervene directly in the economy through those 5 levers is just as relevant in areas of low growth as it is in areas of high growth. The question that you need to ask of those levers is different, but the opportunity to deploy them is the same. And I know that some of the work that the Centre for London done recently on procurement really demonstrates that in a powerful way. Because I think that's in a time when we know that resources are constrained, and that there are huge challenges on our doorstep. Making the most of the wealth that we have got and the resources that we've got at our disposal is more important than ever. So that's been a little bit about whistle-stop tour through some of our thoughts on this, and some of our thoughts on community wealth building, and really looking forward to the rest of the discussion. So thanks.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Really, lots of really interesting stuff there. I'd love to talk about local authority procurement all day. I genuinely think it's fascinating, but I suspect that other people in the audience might prefer that we didn't, but please do have a look at CLES and Centre for London's work on this. Just one quick question, if I may. It's been a funny sort of autumn for all sorts of reasons, and this event has ended up being held about 2 months later than we initially planned it. And I wondered if the changing situation in England over those last few months has changed your thinking about shared challenges at CLES.
I think I think what it's done is it's reinforced the urgency of the challenges that we face. I think the pandemic did that. The pandemic showed really up in Technicolor just how unequal a country we are, in that we know that if you were living in an area of higher than average deprivation, you were much more likely to contract the COVID, and also to have long COVID as well. So I think it kind of really reinforced the inequality that we already have. And I think that was one of the positive things about the Levelling Up white paper, in that there was a really explicit acknowledgement in there that those inequalities exist, and the need for action to deliver on tackling those challenges. I think what cost of living has done is that it's, cost of living hasn't just, I guess, arrived, it's been pitched as this cost of living crisis, but actually it's been brewing for a long time. And it's really, I think, more about a systemic challenge that we see in our economy around wealth inequality, and around the impact of continual cuts to public services over the last decade or so. And I think that has, I guess, changed my mind on what the solutions are going forward. And I think particularly it's changed my view that we need to really try to capture some of that momentum that we saw during the pandemic, where people were willing to think differently, to work across silos, to work at pace, to try and deal with the issues on their doorstep. There was a real sort of sense of having to do things differently in order to meet a very immediate and present challenge. And I think almost like as soon as we took our masks off, we kind of went back to doing things in the same way. Not everyone did, but some people, I think that generally, there was a sort of sense of, leaving some of that momentum behind. And I think there's a real sense, I think, for me, about the challenge we've got going forward isn't necessarily, obviously there's always a challenge around resources and about skills, but there's also, I think, a challenge about how do we try to harness some of what we saw during that pandemic, that ability to think differently, to be able to reimagine the challenges, and being willing, I think, at times to collapse some of those boundaries between organisations so that we can see the shared agenda, the shared mission, rather than the kind of the barriers and silos that we put up around ourselves in our organisations. And I think that flexibility, that imagination, I think in a time of crisis, that ability to work quickly and at pace is now going to be more important than ever, because it's clear that this is, we just haven't had one crisis, but we're having multiple crises. And now looking towards climate change as well, I think that ability to really move at pace and with imagination is going to be critical.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Really interesting. And thank you also to our first person to put a question in the Q&A. We're always very pleased for the first person, both on Zoom and in our live events, to do that. So now over to Councillor John Merry, who has a really interesting dual role as both a local councillor and as the chair of Core Cities, to talk about how you perceive these challenges and shared opportunities. Thank you.
Hi Claire, it's Key Cities actually, rather.
Oh goodness, I'm so sorry.
Yes, not that we have any rivalry, of course, but I just wanted to start by saying I was absolutely fascinated by Sarah's analysis, and a large part I agree with it. The question from us, from local authorities, is how best to actually respond to the changing circumstances and deal with that. And perhaps by way of background, I ought to tell you that I come from a family that's passionately committed to local government. I was born and brought up in Birmingham. My father was a councillor in Birmingham. My mother was a councillor in Staffordshire, and my sister is currently deputy leader in Cardiff. So I've got a certain amount of experience around the dinner table of arguing about the issues around local government and about how we can best take this forward. And I think one of the things I did gain from my experiences in Birmingham is a belief in municipal entrepreneurship and the ability of local authorities to get things done and to make things happen where there is actually a will. And Salford perhaps is a good example of that. The creation of the CLES and media cities, which has been an enormous success story, was down to a council that was absolutely committed to transforming the area that it actually occupied into something that would give it a future. One of the important parts of what I've learned over the last 30 years is the change that has taken place in cities over that period. Because when I first got on the council, Salford, along with many other northern authorities, was an area of declining population and declining opportunity. And that situation was reversed. People suddenly discovered that they wanted to live in cities, that they wanted to be part of what's going on, and they became exciting places to live. And Salford, whatever else, is certainly not a boring place to live. It's certainly got lots of things going on. But the important point is its belief that it can actually transform itself into something that's slightly different from where it is at the moment. And when I came to chair Key Cities, that was the most important message I think that I wanted to get across. Cities are centres of innovation. They are centres of economic progress. They are not simply problems for the government, they are opportunities as well. And whether it's London, whether it's even Manchester or Salford or Birmingham, they are areas where economic potential is still there that can be actually unwrapped. And part of my mission as chair of Key Cities is to get that message across to government that these are incredibly important places, not just because they want to develop themselves, but because they are part of the economic powerhouse that we're trying to create in this country. Now, the other issue that I try and get across to central government all the time is that sort of deciding in Whitehall what is best for areas is not necessarily the best way of going about it. What is required, for example, in Bradford or Bournemouth, to name two of our members, maybe they may have similarities, but they have a lot of differences as well. And if I could take something like the skills agenda, for example, Bradford is becoming a place of innovation in textiles, given its tradition. That's something that works for it. We are becoming an area around Media City that is rapidly acquiring a reputation for electronic games, for the media studies that are taking place there, and for the opportunities that we are creating. So in terms of actually getting our local populations to meet those particular needs, we require something that is slightly different, and that's something that we can direct in a better way. One of the lessons I learned from the pandemic is that central government doesn't always know best, because, and I know it's contentious, and I know that the former Prime Minister likes to claim sometimes that it was him who actually transformed the situation over the pandemic. And yes, he did make a positive contribution, but it was local government that actually delivered those services on the ground. Sometimes it was a bit like trying to run a sort of old style Soviet Union supermarket when you were never quite sure what deliveries would arrive the next day, whether the right vaccines would arrive or whether the right protective equipment would arrive. But we made it work. And we provided the opportunities at a local level for people to take advantage of what central government was providing. And I would like to think that the civil service in Whitehall has actually got that message, that actually allowing local authorities to run things and to look after things is a better strategy than simply centralising things. Now, the third point I wanted to make is, to be honest, I don't actually agree with Gove, but I do actually think he's a positive step forward in terms of the coming back to levelling up. Because one of the things I got the impression about was that when we ran, for example, when we participated in the Northern Powerhouse Convention, he actually got the importance of levelling up, the importance of it not just for individual areas, but for the country as a whole. And I'm looking forward to trying to work with him to try and salvage whatever we can from the current economic crisis to make things happen and to make things happen right across the country. So my clear message is that I think urban areas are very exciting areas where the innovation is taking place, where opportunities are going to be created. It will be the core cities, key cities, and London that needs to combine, I think, to get that message across of the importance of us in terms of innovation, in terms of change, and in terms of the economic strategy required. And Sarah, I do accept that growth on its own is not enough. I do, however, and I think you'd agree with this, regard growth as a necessary prerequisite for the change and development that we're taking place. I want to see everybody take advantage of it, but I also want to see that growth happen, and to happen in the areas where traditionally it hasn't happened. So I think this is an exciting opportunity, this particular webinar, to discuss our combined belief in the importance of urban areas as organs of change and innovation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. And yeah, really lots of really interesting examples there. I was particularly interested in how you were talking about different specializations within the key cities. You should be choosing the ones at the start of the alphabet, because that's something that we've been really struck by as we've been doing this levelling up work, is the relative lack of regional specialization in the UK compared to some other European countries, where there are quite strong sort of clusters around particular cities. I wondered before we move on to Anthony, if you could just say a little bit more about how you see collaborations between cities. I know that's something that's important to your role, and whether there are any kind of inspiring examples for you of cities working together on shared objectives.
Yes, I mean, I think that's one of the advantages of the Key Cities Network, is it's brought together places that you wouldn't necessarily think had similarities to work on combined strategies. One I could quote you with very simply is Lancaster, which incorporates Morecambe, working very closely with Exeter. And you might think, well, they're very different places, but they've got a lot of issues around tourism, a lot of issues around being near to the coast that they're actually working very effectively on. And I think that's one of the things I think CLES has done very well over the years, is actually bring together people of diverse interests. I've been working very closely with Bournemouth, for example, and they're not a traditional place that Salford would necessarily work with. But the fact is that although we come from different political parties, we all have a passionate belief in local government and the ability of local government to make its own decisions. And I think that's something that we can get across very effectively by collaboration. The final example I would give is that the work we're doing with core cities and London councils over climate change is quite crucial, actually. Is the ideas about bringing together the private sector and the public sector in terms of investment in climate change. We can provide lots of investable opportunities across the whole of those organisations.
Thank you very much. Yes, some really interesting examples there. I had not thought of Exeter and Lancaster, but now you say it, it seems quite obvious. And there's much more in our upcoming report on levelling up, on some of the collaborations that John has already mentioned, and also some other ones. So our final panelist today is Councillor Anthony Okereke, of the leader of the Royal Borough of Greenwich. So waving across South East London to Anthony, great to hear your thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Claire, for the introduction, and thank you, Sarah and John, earlier on for your comments as well. And I'm just glad that we're having this discussion and just hearing the points that John made about the importance of local government and area and place, and that sense of really believe in our ability to shift things in our areas. And just to approach the discussion topic, well, I think levelling up is a real opportunity to tackle some of our inequalities that we see in our areas, and tackle some of the health inequalities that we see in our places. And I think when we have this discussion, sometimes we spend time talking about it in a way that see us compete against one another, and actually by doing that, what we do is then spend time being in a position when it's us, our place versus another place. And actually by doing that, we miss the important conversation and the dialogue of how we work together. And there's something in levelling up that actually through working together, we can acknowledge the difficulties around each other's place, and with our joint and shared ambition, use that as a principle to work together. And I think there's a lot that can be done there to solve that. Now, in the Royal Borough of Greenwich, where I'm leader, we have a lot of deprivation, areas of real deprivation, areas of real poverty, and actually we need to solve and focus how we lift people up the social mobility ladder. And in doing that, we have our own agenda. So one of the things we're trying to do is reduce our health inequalities in places like Thamesmead, and reduce deprivation. And by doing this, we're hoping that we can invest in the area, and that obviously requires us to level it up by virtue of getting better jobs in there, getting better transport in there, getting better housing in there. Now, those are the kind of opportunities that we get to tackle, but there's challenges in there. Is that as a local authority, we're facing the cost of living crisis, which we have to deal with at the moment. We are facing the lack of housing affordability. We are facing taking on adult social care burdens, which obviously a lot of our funding goes on to solving these big issues, whilst also thinking about how we tackle our objectives in that. And I wanted to talk about some of the challenges that comes from having these opportunities, that we don't get enough investment for transport, we don't get enough investment for housing, and we're almost at a standstill space. So whilst there are so many opportunities in levelling up, sometimes we don't feel we have the opportunity to move things forward by the virtue of the lack of investment we have, but still think we're the prime people to do that. And I'll take an example of what good devolution looks like. So if you come to Woolwich, which is in Greenwich, there's an opportunity there to really change that area, provide more housing, provide more infrastructure and more transport. And over the years, we've been doing that. So we've invested heavily in having a crossrail station, which has opened up a new economic route for some of our residents to get new jobs. We've also invested in bringing the town centre back into to bring in the leisure centre back into the town centre, which obviously creates culture And we've invested heavily in housing. So we've got a joint venture with a developer in which we are building new affordable housing and private housing, which is also going to substitute the leisure centre. So that's to show you what we can do as local authorities to help level up that area. So we're creating new jobs, we're creating we're investing in new transport links. We're also investing in the economy, trying to change the labour market. And we're doing that by putting our own money into it. And so therefore it shows as a council, we're very good at creating place for our residents. We understand our areas. And one thing we need to do is make sure that we're at the forefront of changing our areas. But that needs to be, we need to be able to give in the investment and the ability to do that in a very agile way. We also have a community wealth building strategy at the moment. So I'm glad Sarah talked about it at the moment, because what Greenwich is trying to do is make sure that it brings people together so that people can benefit from our economy. We want to have an inclusive economy where people benefit from economic activity. And that's also key to how we want to bring people forward and level them up through the projects that we have. And we want to do this with our anchor organizations and our partners who are in the borough. So I guess my call to action for government is going to be one that speaks about recognize how local authorities work. We've managed to show innovation in the way we use Section 106 and CIL. We've managed to show how we shape our places. And actually, if we have the opportunity to be funded effectively, we can also focus on how we level up our areas while also dealing with the complications in our areas. But at the moment, where funding is so short, we're almost competing. Do we help people in the midst of a cost of living crisis, or do we use that money on projects which are suffering from inflation, which have a knock-on benefit to tackling health inequalities and housing inequality? And that's the real challenge that we're facing. Is it going to be one or the other? We need to make sure that we can say to government that in whatever they give to us and whatever settlement they give to us or funding they give to us, that they allow us to be flexible to decide how we can shape our own areas and ensure that we can tackle our inequalities and health inequalities that exist. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anthony. And yeah, for those who haven't yet been to Woolwich in recent years, I very much recommend that you do. It's a really interesting example, I think, of seeing regeneration coming from transport, but also from a whole range of other activities. And now, of course, you can get them on the Elizabeth line, so it's super easy. Just one more question directly from me to Anthony before we go to the audience Q&A, and thank you to everybody who has been putting your questions in. You talked a lot about the complexity and the depth of the challenges that you face in Greenwich. And I wondered how far you see those as similar to or different from the challenges that colleagues in local government are facing in other parts of London and other parts of England.
So I don't think they're that different. You know, like we're all trying to tackle deprivation in our areas. We're all trying to make sure that people have a good home. We're all trying to ensure that we can meet our climate objectives. Right across the landscape, councils have declared climate emergencies. So the challenges that we all have are very large and very, very big. And we're all going about it in very different ways. One thing we will need to think about is that actually in London in itself, through the GLA, we've formed a partnership of how we can do that work together. So if you see, sometimes you see us going in for joint funding together in one cause, or attacking real topics like housing together. For instance, where we have a lack of temporary accommodation in the area, we focus on how we can secure temporary accommodation together. So that's why I wanted to touch on the point about how working together can tackle things, because actually these challenges are shared across the board. And the same, you know, with what John mentioned about, you know, working in their district. I think we can tackle some of these challenges by joining up and using our innovative approaches. So I think there shouldn't be a hierarchy, but we should focus on making sure that whatever issue we're dealing with, it's about how can London's issue help Manchester's issues, and see if we can get to the outcomes that we both want for our areas. Thank you.
Thank you so much. A really interesting set of reflections and examples there, and I think actually takes us beautifully into the first question that's been asked in our Q&A. I'm looking at the one that's had the most upvotes. So thank you to Caroline from London Councils. And Caroline says it's great to hear examples of cities working together, and she agrees with them a lot. She mentions free CI that John also mentioned. And then she asks, what are the barriers to cities working together in these ways, and how can we overcome them, collaborate more and get our voices better heard? This feels like a good one for everybody in our panel. I can see that John has unmuted, which I'm hoping might mean he'd like to have a go at answering it first, and then I'll come to Anthony and Sarah.
This is a really interesting issue, because we probably get on a lot better with authorities a bit further away from Salford than necessarily the ones absolutely next door to each other. So I'm a passionate believer that things need to be dealt with at the appropriate level. So I'm a supporter of the Manchester Combined Authority, but I wouldn't want to see it take away all the power from the local council. So I think it's about collaboration. It's about what I used to talk about in terms of the EU, about subsidiarity as well, and about trying to retain our own identities within an overall alliance. But the fact remains, we've got a lot more in common than divides us, really. We've got a lot more in terms of the issues that we're all facing, and in terms of a central government of whatever political party that doesn't necessarily understand local government. And I will be absolutely passionately committed to working with all urban areas to try to get that message across.
Thank you very much, John. Anthony, anything you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a real opportunity to think about how we're using funding more innovatively. Good example of that is in terms of trying to tackle the climate agenda. How do we know we're trying to achieve the same goals? Can we use the same funding and put it together to kind of lift our areas up? If we're all trying to build solar, if we're all trying to get solar on top of our roofs, how can we maybe go into the procurement together? So there's real opportunities there in that. Through working together, I think we can help each other up. When we talk about creating new jobs for our areas and creating new opportunities for people, that heading in that direction should be thought about more in a regional way. And that's happening in London through like the London Local Hub, Local London, and also when we saw the Olympics and the way we got funding to deliver and increase more jobs. So that regional working helps us kind of achieve that, but it takes a lot of work, and we really have to be committed in working with each other to deliver on those set joint principles that we hold.
Thanks, Anthony. And finally, very much not least, Sarah, collaborations between cities.
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree with everything that's been said so far on this, and I think I suppose, I mean, a lot of it's down to relationships, isn't it? And I, seeing these challenges not as in competition with each other, but as complementary. I guess the way in which the funding for Levelling Up isn't really conducive to that, in that places are pitched against each other in competition for kind of a ever decreasing levels of funding. So I guess there is something about, and that's something that we've written to the Ministry for Levelling Up to say that we need to have a proper strategic funding for this stuff, which goes through local government, so that we can actually get on and do it, rather than spending all our time writing bids for whatever pot has come out this week. So I think that is having a much more strategic approach to it. And I think as well, we are still waiting on kind of a fair funding settlement for local government. And we do need to look at a long-term funding solution for local government, rather than simply talking about austerity all the time. So I think those kind of having those basic building blocks in place, I think would enable people to actually start to kind of raise their head above the parapet and think, well, who else can we kind of work with on this? I think as well, networks like the key cities and core cities are brilliant ways for people to kind of work together. And certainly the work that we do in some of our communities of practice hopefully is helpful in that regard as well. And the final thing I wanted to mention was, I think within places, we talk about, you know, the challenge of collaboration between places, but I think within places collaboration can be tricky. And a lot of the work that we've been doing is on community wealth building is about how do you encourage public sector anchor organisations to actually, you know, come together with a mission approach to dealing with some of the challenges in their area. So how can they pool resources on recruitment? How can they pool resources on procurement? How can they think about how they use their land and assets collectively to tackle common challenges? And that work is tricky, and we've been doing that work in Birmingham for a few years now, bringing together 7 of the city's biggest anchor organisation, turnover about 5 billion, workforce of about 50,000. And it is tricky, and it's about relationships, and it's about people being willing to sit down together and co-design and co-create something which is larger than the sum of their parts. But I think in an era of crisis, that is even more important than ever.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And yeah, couldn't agree more about the competitive funding pots thing. It was sort of alluded to in the white paper that the government thought that competitive funding pots were a good idea, but were a bad idea, but they didn't really seem to follow that through.
No, they didn't. In fact, they just created more funding pots for people to bid for, you know.
But it has been, you know, certainly from my point of view, really positive to see how many organisations representing different parts of the whole of the UK coming out and saying, look, please don't make us compete against each other. And, you know, it's not just the groups who've traditionally been the losers in local government funding who've been saying that. So we all seem to agree on what we think needs to happen.
And the problem is as well that money doesn't even, you know, inevitably it doesn't go anywhere near replacing the funding that's been lost from local government as well. And, you know, that's the, you know, you just run to standstill all the time.
So when you're having to compete for what is essentially core basic funding, that becomes very difficult indeed. Please do keep asking and upvoting questions. I'm going to come to the one from Stephen Boxall now. And Stephen says, can the panel say something about sorting and the practice of counting success as a place gets better, but that's actually because of wealthier people moving in and rents and house prices increasing and poorer people being forced out? So essentially a place gets wealthier, but the people who were living in it before don't get wealthier. And I know that that's certainly been a concern about a number of the places that people here represent. Would any of our panel like to respond to Stephen's question?
Okay.
I'll go John and then Anthony and then Sarah if she'd like to.
I'll stick my head above the parapet on this one.
Thank you.
Salford was accused, and Sarah knows this, about creating yuppie paradises and attracting wealthy people into it. I felt a bit resentful about this because the argument was advanced by certain London journalists that Salford should be a sort of theme park where only poor people were allowed to live, actually. I want to create a diverse community and not forcing people out, far from it, but bringing new people in. And that's why Salford's population has expanded. So as far as I'm concerned, we need diverse communities. We need people from all walks of life in our particular area. And I don't think people are forced out as a result of the policies that we've been following.
Thank you. Anthony.
Yeah, I'll start by saying, I guess, you know, there is a level as places change. For instance, when Crossrail came to Woolwich, as places changed, Crossrail came to Woolwich and lifted land prices, which obviously made the area more desirable. The fact that there was a new transport hub coming made more development come into the area. Now, there is an invisible inequality that exists when that kind of happens. And our job as local authority leaders is to limit the harsher effects of gentrification, which occurs when land values raise. And in doing that, that is making sure that we can create areas that are diverse, making a mix of people that are going to be there, living in that area. and that is the delivery of affordable and social housing. So we know that the market is very good at providing affordable housing, and local authorities need to be able to ensure that. And when an area is getting regenerated, the way you have people not moving out on the area is by making sure there's a mix between different tenures in housing to keep people in a space. So I don't think we aim to force people out. I think it can happen as a risk of there not being enough social and affordable housing when regeneration takes place. And that's why we've got to get that balance right of making sure we don't lose that focus of providing those kind of tenures for an area, because you then create invisible inequalities of having only one demographic of type of people living in an area. Thank you.
Thanks, Anthony. I was just thinking as you were speaking that between you and John, you must represent some of the places which have had the largest number of new homes delivered in the last 10 years of almost anywhere in the country. Sarah, would you like to come in on this one?
Yeah, I'll just try and be brief, but there was a really interesting paper written back in 2009 during the new Labour years, which talked specifically about neighbourhood churn and about, you know, the sort of dynamics of that. So I mean, I can share the link, but it's well worth a read, because I think a lot of what it says in there kind of resonates today. And I think ultimately, you know, as the others have said, you know, housing plays a massive role in this, and we know that things like right to buy have had a massive impact on people's ability to move across places, and also the kind of rise of the private rented sector and how that also kind of feeds into the dynamics of place. And I think we've got a planning system which aims to intervene to ensure that regardless of where you live, you can try and live a better life, but that is very highly centralised and doesn't necessarily respond to the particular characteristics of place. And I think ultimately there's a cautionary tale in here about being too dependent on regeneration or economic development, which is predicated on land value increases, because land value if land values rise, that's seen as an indicator of success, and I can see why that's the case. But at the same time, there is another side to that, and making sure that we are ameliorating the negative impacts of that in terms of people's ability to be able to move around and be able to have choices about where and how they live. So I think that, I mean, it makes the case as to why economic development and why planning intervention is so important, to really ensure that the benefits are much more equally spread, rather than just depending on the land market to do it itself.
Thank you so much, Sarah. I think that point about land value is certainly one that's often on our minds here in London, because every time there's a big, as Anthony alluded to, every time there's a big public transport infrastructure project, that affects land values, and that has all sorts of complex effects. Our next question is a lovely short and sweet one from Mark Jenkinson, and I'm going to come to Sarah with it first, because I think it's quite related to some of the work you do at CLES, Sarah. And Mark asks, what role can businesses, and particularly SMEs, play?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think they're absolutely fundamental, and I think for us, a successful place is somewhere where people are able to feel able to set up a business, to run a business, and be able to have a business to enable a business to grow as well. So we would argue that community wealth building is a really useful tool to be able to help support businesses in an area, particularly SMEs. And I think often SMEs are pretty generative, because they often have a really close relationship with the area in which they are based. They often employ local people. They often support local communities more generally. So they are a really important building block of a decent economy. And through community wealth building, through some of the levers I mentioned, there's a really active way in which public sector anchor organisations through procurement can support and nurture businesses by making sure that opportunities are available to them. And that might mean about simply getting to know businesses and encouraging them to tender for opportunities and to become suppliers. But it may also be by thinking about the size of contracts that we're letting, and how we can reduce them to a size which is much more easy for small businesses to bid for. I know that there's lots of really good work going on across London and Greenwich, but also in Westminster and other parts of London to really kind of make that happen. And I think similarly, the way in which business support is offered in this country, making sure that that's really supporting new startups and new businesses and enabling SMEs to grow rather than simply helping those that perhaps could help themselves anyway. So I think really SMEs are crucially important and I think much more generative potentially for local economies than perhaps some of those bigger companies that are fairly kind of on route, if you like, would kind of go where the next opportunity leads them. But you want to kind of really keep those SMEs close. The last thing to say on that is we're seeing a lot of interest at the minute in employee ownership. And I know Wales are doing lots of work on that at the minute and thinking about if businesses are getting into trouble in the current crises, how can we make sure that those businesses, there's an option for employees to buy those businesses out so that you keep those businesses local and you keep that income local. And that's something I know there's a lot of interest in Wales and in Scotland. And I think it's also something that's a pretty live conversation in parts of England too. And I think potentially, a real opportunity.
Thanks, Sarah. Yeah, we've been hearing about some really interesting examples of employee ownership operating at quite different scales, which is different sizes of organisations. I'll come to Anthony and then John. Anthony, you mentioned work on community wealth building that's happening in Greenwich. How do you see the role of businesses and SMEs in community wealth building and levelling up?
Well, just as a good example, we know that approach of employing local people is so great for our small medium enterprises and large companies in Greenwich, and that's a huge opportunity to get people into jobs. One of the things we've been doing is through the cost of living crisis, is having a conversation with businesses about how they're finding things in this crisis, and in that conversation, there's a role to take. There's work we can do as local authorities to take that further. And in one of the things we'll be doing is launching a new a business support grant, which is going to be focused on making some of our local businesses real living wage accredited employees. So we know we want to get people on a decent living wage. Actually, is there work we can be doing to help businesses be able to get jobs that pay a London real living wage, which we can help enable. So we've launched that fund during the cost of living crisis, but that stuff like that direct relationship with our small medium enterprises and large organizations shows the partnership working that can be achieved to get people into jobs that pay a real London living wage. And obviously when it comes to development, I'll give you a good example. We know as part of the supply chain, there's a huge opportunity there to make sure local people can benefit from that regeneration or a development that's happening in the area. So it's making sure that we partner with investors in our area to get jobs to local people. So we have a job support finder for people, which we call GLAB, which helps get people jobs. For instance, if your Barclay Homes is building down the road, some of those jobs go straight out to those who are registered to our GLAB employment finder service. And actually that's that direct link that we're using as our enabling ability as a local authority to say we'll be the conduit between the investor and our residents, because we know our residents who are looking for jobs and who can benefit from that economic activity. And that's the role we want to be playing.
Brilliant, thank you. I'm going to ask John to come in very briefly, if I may, because we're almost out of time.
Right, it's crucial as strategy in terms of SMEs in Salford. 3 key things for us. We want them to pay the real living wage. We want them to employ local people in terms of the jobs involved. And we also want them to provide apprenticeships so that there is a future for people as a result of that. So yes, it's absolutely vital to us.
Thank you very much. That was admirably brief and succinct. And I'm very sorry to those people whose questions we didn't get to. There were loads of interesting ones there, and I'm only sorry we didn't have longer. I'm just going to hand over to my colleague Nick, now our Chief Executive, who will do our final thank yous and close for today. Nick.
Thank you, Claire. Thank you to panelists for a really interesting discussion. Thanks to Chris for his intro. Thanks to Claire for chairing. I know how difficult it is to chair online events like this when you're juggling about 15 things at once. And thanks to the Centre for London team behind the scenes who've helped to make today happen, but also helped to make it run very smoothly, because there's a lot of there's a lot of things that happen behind the scenes technically that are slightly beyond my comprehension, but are really critical. And thank you to everybody that's tuned in, and thank you to the sponsors that have helped us to deliver on this project. I guess just a couple of final comments from me. I mean, Sarah knows the way to my heart by saying that levelling up is more than just about people, it's also about places. I'm a geographer, so I like to hear those comments, but you're dead right. I think it's not just either on its own, it is a mix of both, because I think if you lose one or the other, you're never going to really be able to solve the problem. And people are influenced by where they live, whether some people like that or not. I thought John's point about cities being the drivers of innovation and creating the economic potential is really important. So I still don't really think that Westminster and Whitehall gets that. I think they think that they're the key factor in all of that, but actually we've seen that a lot of public policy innovation, we've seen it in London certainly, comes out of mayors and local authorities. And that happens even with limited powers. So imagine what could happen if there was much more devolution to towns, cities and regions. And then on Anthony's point, I know Greenwich pretty well, and I think he got across really well the importance that infrastructure projects can play. The Crossrail station at Woolwich is absolutely critical to that regeneration of that part of the borough. Originally, there wasn't going to be a station there on the line. It was going to miss Greenwich and run straight through to the Isle of Dogs, but the local council, government and mayor's office worked together really well, and actually the private sector delivered the station box. It was Berkeley Homes, and it just shows that you work with the private sector, public sector coming together can actually deliver some really big changes that can drive economic development. And also, I think Anthony touched on that point about anchor institutions. Everybody's got these in their areas, and I don't think we still make the most of them. London-wide, there's an enormous number, but then most of the local authorities have them too. And I think the job of convening and coalescing around some shared objectives, which I know is the kind of work that CLES do a lot on, can be a real driver of change and really help to link up opportunities to those that need them the most. Particularly when they are in different parts of the local area in the city. So yeah, just to say finally that 11 Up's had a kind of slightly weird couple of months. It's been a bit hokey cokey really. 1 minute it's in, next minute it's out, then it's back in again, which kind of sums up the kind of political change that's been in Westminster. But I think we all agree that Michael Gove coming back is going to be a good thing for the agenda, and we'll look forward to how that develops over the coming months. So just finally to say thank you once again to everybody that's tuned in. Thank you to everybody that's been involved, and I hope you have a really great rest of your day. Sorry, Claire, I forgot to say the most important thing, that the report's launching in a couple of weeks. Can we, I'm sure we'll send an email out